The silence of the land was the only company Caleb Blackwood kept. It was a silence that lived in the endless blue of the Montana sky and settled like dust on the weathered planks of his solitary cabin. At 38, Caleb moved with despair. Deliberate economy of a man who has learned that no motion should be wasted. His face was a map of his life, carved by sun and wind, his eyes holding a quiet grief that was as vast and empty as the prairie stretching in every direction from his porch. His days were a rhythm of hard labor, a metronome set against the steady beat of his own solitude, mending fences that strained against the relentless wind, tending to cattle that were little more than dark specks against the immense landscape. The quiet, lonely meals he took at a table set for one. The ranch was his inheritance and his prison, a sprawling testament to a life he had once planned to fill with laughter and noise. Now, it only echoed the hollowness inside him. The reminders were everywhere, small ghosts in the corners of his life. On the rough-hewn mantel above the stone fireplace sat a child's wooden horse, its paint worn smooth by small, eager hands. Its head was cocked at a jaunty angle, a frozen moment of play that time refused to erase. Caleb's gaze would sometimes snag on it, just for a second, before he forced his eyes away, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Outside, on a windswept hill that overlooked the valley, 3 simple wooden crosses stood against the sky. One was for his father, a tall, sturdy marker. Beside it were 2 smaller ones. He never let himself look at those 2 for long. The memory of the fever that had swept through his home 7 years prior was a wound that had scarred over but never truly healed, leaving him with nothing but the silence and the land. And the land was a formidable companion. It was a place of harsh, unforgiving beauty. The wind was a constant presence, a scouring force that stripped the plains bare in winter and baked them dry in summer. It whispered through the tall prairie grass, a sound like 1,000 secrets being told at once. The sky was a tyrant, capable of delivering scorching sun, sudden, violent thunderstorms, or a blanket of snow so thick and heavy it could bury the world. To survive here was to be in a constant state of struggle, a daily battle waged against the elements, against predators, against the crushing weight of isolation. Yet, in the golden light of dawn or the deep purple of twilight, when the distant mountains seemed to rise like jagged promises, there was a raw magnificence to it all that held a man captive, a beauty that was as brutal as it was breathtaking. Into this world of stark survival and quiet sorrows, a new presence arrived. Her name was Alara, and she stepped off the morning stagecoach into the dusty main street of Redemption with a single, worn valise in her hand. The town was little more than a handful of wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness of the plains. A mercantile, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church whose steeple seemed to be straining to touch a heaven that felt impossibly far away. Alara was in her late 20s, with a face that might have been called beautiful if not for the profound guardedness in her eyes. It was a look that kept the world at arm's length, a shield against intrusion. She moved with a quiet purpose, seeking not friendship or welcome, but simple work. She found it at the mercantile, where the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, a man more interested in coin than character, hired her to mend clothes and help stock shelves. Her arrival was a stone tossed into the still, shallow pond of Redemption society. A woman alone, with no husband, no family, and no history she was willing to share, was an anomaly, and anomalies bred suspicion. The whispers started almost immediately, slithering from the pews of the church to the tables of the saloon. The women of the town, led by the sharp-eyed wife of the preacher, watched her with undisguised disapproval. They noted her plain but well-made dress, the graceful way she walked, and the resolute set of her jaw. They saw not a woman seeking refuge, but a mystery that needed to be solved and, most likely, condemned. The men looked too, some with a crude curiosity, others with the same suspicion as their wives. The speculation was cruel and imaginative, painting her as a woman of low morals, a runaway, someone with a shameful past she was trying to outrun. Alara seemed not to notice, or perhaps she was simply too practiced at ignoring it. She did her work, spoke only when spoken to, and retreated each evening to the small, sparse room she rented above the mercantile, her solitude as complete as Caleb Blackwood's. Caleb's path first crossed with hers a few weeks after her arrival. He rode into town for supplies, his monthly ritual a necessary break in the monotony of ranch life. The mercantile was filled with the familiar smells of leather, coffee, and dry goods. He saw her behind the counter, carefully measuring out a length of calico fabric for a customer. He stood by the barrels of nails and flour, waiting his turn, and listened to the low murmur of conversation around him. He heard Mrs. Peterson whisper to her friend about the new woman, her voice laced with sanctimonious pity. He saw the way Mr. Henderson watched Alara. His eyes narrowed, as if expecting her to pocket a spool of thread. When it was his turn, he stepped forward and placed his list on the counter. Alara looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met. He saw past the guard she held up like a fortress wall and glimpsed something deep inside, a profound and weary sadness that he recognized with a jolt. It was the same sorrow that stared back at him from his own reflection on dark, lonely nights. The interaction was brief, professional. He read out his list: flour, salt, coffee, cartridges. She gathered the items without a word, her movements swift and efficient. She tallied the cost, her voice low and even. He paid in coin, their fingers brushing for a fleeting instant as he took his change. He saw the faintest tremor in her hand before she pulled it away. He tipped his hat, a gesture of ingrained politeness, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. As he carried his supplies out, he heard the whispers resume behind him, but he kept his own counsel. The woman with the sad eyes stayed in his thoughts for longer than he would have liked on the long ride back to his empty ranch. The weather turned a week later, with a sudden and vicious fury that caught even the most seasoned settlers by surprise. The sky, which had been a clear, crisp blue in the morning, turned the color of a dull pewter by noon. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that quickly rose to a terrifying shriek. Then the snow began, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain that erased the horizon and turned the world into a churning vortex of white. It was an early blizzard, a hungry beast that had descended from the mountains without warning. Alara had been asked to deliver a small package to a homestead a few miles out of town. She had rented a small wagon and a tired old horse, eager to prove her usefulness. The storm caught her on the return journey, miles from the relative safety of redemption. The road vanished beneath the rapidly accumulating snow. The horse, panicked by the wind and the cold, stumbled and went down, snapping a shaft of the wagon. Alara was thrown into a snowdrift, the wind stealing the breath from her lungs. She fought her way back to her feet, her thin coat offering little protection against the biting cold. Disoriented and shivering, she tried to lead the horse, but the animal would not budge. The cold was a physical thing, a creeping numbness that started in her fingers and toes and worked its way inward, slowing her thoughts, dulling her fear into a resigned exhaustion. She huddled against the side of the useless wagon, the snow piling up around her, the world dissolving into a featureless, hostile white. Caleb was on the far edge of his property, checking the northern fence line. It was a task he undertook whenever a storm threatened, ensuring his cattle wouldn't wander and perish. He was on his way back to the cabin, his head bowed against the wind, when his horse, a steady, reliable gelding named Silas, suddenly shied. The horse whinnied, its ears twitching, and refused to move forward. Caleb peered through the driving snow, his eyes slitted against the icy particles. At first, he saw nothing but the swirling chaos. Then he saw it, a dark shape half buried in a drift, a shape that did not belong. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow, and made his way toward the shape. It was the wagon, its wheels sticking up at a drunken angle, and beside it, almost completely covered, was a smaller mound. He brushed the snow away and felt a surge of disbelief. It was the woman from the mercantile. Her face was deathly pale, her lips blue. He pressed his fingers against her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter against the cold skin. For a moment, he was frozen by indecision. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of solitude. Bringing her into it was a complication he did not want. The quiet emptiness of his life was a painful but predictable thing. But leaving her here was a death sentence, and his fundamental decency, buried deep beneath layers of grief and isolation, would not allow it. With a low grunt, he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He carried her to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him, wrapping his own heavy coat around her as best he could. He turned Silas toward home, the howling wind at his back, the unconscious woman a strange and unnerving presence in his solitary world. The initial hours in the cabin were filled only with the roar of the blizzard outside and the crackle of the fire he built high in the hearth. He laid her on the cot in the corner, covering her with thick wool blankets. He worked to bring the warmth back into her, rubbing her hands and feet until the color began to return. He managed to spoon some warm broth between her lips, though she did not seem to wake. She was trapped in a delirious state, muttering words in a language he did not recognize, her body racked with shivers. As he tended to her, he was forced into an intimacy he had not known in 7 years. He gently cleaned a shallow cut on her hand, a raw scrape from her fall. As his calloused fingers touched her skin, she flinched violently in her sleep, a small, terrified cry escaping her lips. He pulled his hand back as if burned. Even in her unconsciousness, she was afraid. He saw then that her fear was not of the storm or the cold, but of him, of his touch. He understood boundaries. He backed away, sitting in his worn armchair by the fire, keeping a silent vigil. He respected her privacy, but he could not help but notice the details. Her clothes were simple but clean, mended in several places with neat, almost invisible stitches. Her hands, though cold and scraped, were not the hands of a woman accustomed to leisure. There were calluses on her palms, the signs of hard work. He found no belongings on her, nothing to identify her beyond the face he remembered from the mercantile. She was a blank slate, a woman who had walked out of nowhere into the heart of a blizzard. For 2 days, the storm raged, locking them together in the small, warm space of the cabin. She drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. During that time, he became her reluctant caretaker. He sat by her bedside, changing cool cloths on her forehead, listening to the fragmented nightmares that made her cry out in her sleep. He moved about his small home, the familiar space suddenly feeling crowded, his solitary routines disrupted. He would cook his simple meals and leave a bowl of broth or stew on the small table beside her cot, retreating to his own side of the room to eat. He watched her as she slept, the guardedness gone from her face, replaced by a raw vulnerability. He saw the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes and the tension that never seemed to leave her jaw, even in sleep. He wondered what kind of life could put such a look on a person. He saw her competence when, during a brief period of lucidity, she noticed a tear in the sleeve of one of his work shirts hanging by the fire. Her hands, though still weak, moved with a practiced ease as she gestured for his mending kit. He watched, fascinated, as she expertly stitched the tear with small, even stitches, her concentration absolute. In that simple, domestic act, he saw a quiet strength. In turn, she began to observe him. In her clearer moments, she would watch him from the cot, her eyes following him as he moved about the cabin. She saw the way he stoked the fire, his movements sure and steady. She saw the profound loneliness of the place, the single cup hanging from a peg, the worn Bible on the nightstand, the way he would sometimes stand at the window and stare out at the white fury of the storm. His shoulders slumped with a weight she was beginning to recognize. They did not share their stories. They did not speak of the past, but in the enforced silence of the storm-bound cabin, they began to see each other. They were two survivors, each marooned on their own island of pain. And for a brief time, the storm had built a fragile bridge between them. On the morning of the third day, the world outside the cabin was transformed. The wind had died, and an absolute silence had fallen. The snow had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a brilliant, almost blinding light on the pristine white landscape. The storm was over. Caleb prepared to take her back to town. He hitched his horse to the small sleigh he used in winter, its runners gliding silently over the deep snow. Elara was stronger now, the fever gone, the color returned to her cheeks. She was dressed in her own dry clothes, her composure once again a carefully constructed wall. The silence between them was different now, not tense, but filled with unspoken things. As they stood by the door, ready to leave, they had their first real conversation. "The Chinook winds will come after a storm like this," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "It will melt fast. Could be trouble for the livestock down in the lower valley." She looked out at the vast expanse of white, her gaze distant. "I have never seen so much snow." "It's a hard land," he replied, his eyes on the distant mountains. "It gives you just enough to survive, but it always reminds you that it can take everything away in a moment." She turned to look at him then, and the guard in her eyes flickered. For a second, he saw the woman beneath the shield, the one who understood what it meant to have everything taken away. A fragile, unspoken understanding passed between them, a recognition that needed no words. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved my life." He simply nodded, the gesture holding more weight than a dozen sentences. He helped her into the sleigh, and they made the journey back to Redemption in silence. The only sound, the soft swish of the runners on the snow. He stopped at the edge of town, not wanting to invite the inevitable gossip that would come from him arriving with her. She climbed down, pulling her thin coat tightly around herself. She looked back at him one last time, then turned and walked down the street that was just beginning to stir with life. Caleb watched her go, a solitary figure against the bright white snow. He watched until she disappeared inside the mercantile. Then he turned his horse and sleigh around and headed back the way he had come. The tracks they had made were the only marks on the otherwise perfect landscape. As he rode, the silence of the land settled around him once more. But this time, it felt different. It felt sharper, colder, and more profound than it had before. The isolation of his ranch, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a cage. The fragile truce Elara had found in Redemption shattered as quickly as a pane of ice in a thaw. The town, once a place of wary neutrality, became a landscape of open hostility. The whispers that had followed her down the main street now seemed to cling to her like burrs, sharp and persistent. The change was fueled by the Holts, a family whose wealth from a small but prosperous cattle operation had translated into an unshakable sense of moral authority over the town. Martha Holt, a woman whose piety was as starched and rigid as her Sunday collar, saw in Elara a dangerous disruption to the town's fragile social order. An unattached woman with no discernible history was a loose thread. And Mrs. Holt was a weaver who could not abide a single imperfection in her tapestry. She began her campaign subtly, with a word here, a disapproving glance there. She spoke to Mr. Henderson of the importance of reputation, of the kind of clientele a respectable mercantile ought to attract. The other women of the town, eager to remain in Mrs. Holt's good graces, took their cue. Elara found herself ignored at the counter, her greetings met with stony silence. Small cruelties became a daily occurrence. A bolt of fabric she had just neatly stacked would be accidentally knocked to the floor. A mending job she had completed would be returned, with a complaint about a stitch no one could find. Elara bore it with a stoic resignation that the townswomen misinterpreted as arrogance. She did her work, kept her eyes down, and retreated further into herself. But her quiet endurance only seemed to provoke them more. The final blow came on a Tuesday, a small silver locket that Mrs. Holt had been admiring. A new item Mr. Henderson had set out for display went missing. A search was made, a great show of turning the place upside down, and the locket was found, tucked away in the small canvas bag where Elara kept her mending tools. Elara stood frozen as Mr. Henderson held the locket up, his face a mask of false disappointment. She saw the triumphant gleam in Mrs. Holt's eyes. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had been framed. "I did not take it," she said, her voice a low, steady thing in the suddenly silent store. But her words were weightless, lost in the gale of their preconceived notions. She was a woman with secrets, and a woman with secrets was surely a thief. She was dismissed on the spot, her meager wages pressed into her hand with a final, humiliating admonition from Mr. Henderson to leave town before the sheriff got involved. Elara walked out of the mercantile, her back straight, her head held high, not allowing them the satisfaction of her tears. But once she was back in her small, cold room, the facade crumbled. She had nothing, no work, no money to speak of, and a reputation that was now thoroughly ruined. The specter of a past she had run so hard from seemed to be catching up, its shadow falling over her once more. For 2 days she stayed in her room, the small savings she had dwindling with each meal she could not afford. Desperation was a cold, bitter taste in her mouth. She had one last, improbable choice, a choice that meant swallowing the last of her pride and riding out into the wilderness to the home of a man she barely knew, a man who had already saved her once. The ride to Caleb Blackwood's ranch was long and cold. The snow from the blizzard had melted under the Chinook winds, leaving the plains a muddy, desolate brown. She had used her last dollars to rent a horse, a bony nag from the livery. With every mile that passed, her resolve wavered. What was she doing? He was a stranger, a solitary man who had made it clear he wanted no complications in his life. To appear on his doorstep, a beggar asking for work, was to invite a rejection that felt like it would break the last, fragile piece of her spirit. But the alternative, starvation or returning to a world she would rather die than face, was even more terrifying. She found him splitting wood beside his barn, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the vast silence. He stopped when he saw her approach, his body going still, the axe held loosely in one hand. He watched her dismount, his expression unreadable. Elara's words felt like stones in her throat. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice unsteady. "I apologize for the intrusion." He just nodded, waiting. "I am no longer employed at the mercantile," she said, forcing the humiliating words out. "I find myself in need of work, any kind of work. I am strong, and I learn quickly. I can cook, clean, mend. I can help with the stock if you show me how." She trailed off, the plea hanging in the cold air between them. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He leaned the axe against the chopping block and wiped his hands on his trousers. He knew what this had cost her. He was well aware of the town's gossip. News traveled on the wind in a place like Redemption. To hire her would be to invite that gossip to his own front door. It would tie him to her, make him a subject of speculation. His life was quiet, orderly, and safe in its solitude. He had no desire to change that. But then he looked into her eyes, and he saw past the pride and the fear. He saw a quiet, bone-deep desperation that resonated with a part of him he kept locked away. It was the look of a person standing on the edge of a cliff, with nowhere left to turn. He thought of the way she had flinched from his touch in the cabin, of the nightmares that had haunted her sleep. Whatever her past held, it had wounded her deeply. His own wounds, though different, ached in sympathy. "I keep my own house," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "But the ranch books are a mess. I'm better with a branding iron than a pen. And there is always gear that needs mending. Harnesses, tack. He gestured with his chin toward a small, disused cabin that stood a few hundred yards from the main house, nestled in a small stand of cottonwoods. That was the original homestead cabin. It is not much, but it is sturdy. You could live there. I can pay a small wage, plus your keep. Relief washed over Alara so powerfully that her knees felt weak. She had expected a swift refusal, a cold dismissal. Instead, he had offered her not just work, but a home, a sanctuary. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate. "I will not be a burden." He gave a short, sharp nod, as if to close the matter. "Put your horse in the barn. We can talk about the ledgers in the morning." He turned and picked up his axe, and with a powerful swing, he split a log in two, the sound sharp and final. The arrangement had been made. Their life settled into a strange and quiet rhythm. Their working relationship was professional, almost formal. In the mornings, she would walk from her small cabin to the main house, where he had cleared a space for her at the corner of the large kitchen table. She would spend hours there, her head bent over the spidery scrawl of his ledgers, painstakingly bringing order to years of chaotic entries. In the afternoons, she would work in the barn, the smell of leather and hay a comforting presence, her nimble fingers mending a broken strap or polishing a saddle until it gleamed. They worked for long stretches in a comfortable silence, a silence that was not empty but filled with a mutual understanding. They were two people who had learned to live inside their own heads, and they respected that in each other. Their conversations were brief, punctuated by necessity. "The flour is running low. That fence post on the west pasture is loose. It feels like more snow is coming." But in the spaces between the words, a slow familiarity began to grow. Caleb would watch her from a distance as she worked. He saw her resilience, the way she tackled every task with a quiet determination. He noticed her gentle way with the animals. A shy foal that shied away from everyone else would nuzzle its head into her hand. The barn cats would weave around her ankles, purring. He saw a softness in her that the world had tried its best to beat out. Sometimes, when he came in from the cold, he would find a pot of coffee brewing on the stove, a silent offering. He never acknowledged it, but a quiet warmth would spread through his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. Alara, in turn, began to see the man beneath the gruff, silent exterior. She saw the kindness in the way he treated his animals, his voice low and soothing as he tended to a lame horse. She noticed that a stack of fresh firewood would appear on her cabin porch every few days, a task he undertook without her ever having to ask. One evening, she saw him standing on the windswept hill, looking at the 3 wooden crosses, his hat in his hands, his broad shoulders slumped. In his stillness, she saw a grief as profound and as deep as her own, and she felt a pang of connection that startled her with its intensity. One night, the fragile peace of their world was shattered. The winter was hard, and the wolves that roamed the high country had grown desperate and bold, their howls a nightly elegy to their hunger. Caleb heard the first signs of trouble, a low, frantic bleating from the flock of sheep he kept in a pasture near the creek. He grabbed his rifle and a lantern and burst out of the cabin into the frigid, moonlit night. The scene that greeted him was one of chaos. Dark, sleek shapes were moving through the panicked flock, their eyes glowing like malevolent embers in the lantern light. He fired a shot into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing across the valley. The wolves scattered for a moment but did not flee. They were too hungry, too determined. A light appeared in the window of Alara's cabin, and a moment later, she was running toward him, a heavy shawl thrown over her nightdress. "What is it?" she cried, her voice sharp with alarm. "Wolves," he grunted, reloading. "Get the lantern. Try to drive the sheep toward the main paddock. Go!" There was no time for fear. Alara grabbed a second lantern from the barn and, holding it high, ran toward the terrified flock, her voice joining his, shouting to spook the predators. They worked together in the cold darkness, a strange, desperate team. He would fire, and in the flash of the gun, she would see the snarling jaws of a wolf. And then she would run, waving her lantern, pushing the stupid, panicked sheep toward the safety of the fenced enclosure. It was in the midst of this chaos that it happened. A ewe, blind with terror, bolted, crashing into Alara and sending her stumbling backward. To catch her balance, she threw out a hand, her arm scraping hard against a jagged edge of a split-rail fence post. She felt a sharp, searing pain, but ignored it, her focus entirely on the life-and-death struggle unfolding around her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last of the sheep were secured in the paddock. Caleb fired one last shot, and the remaining wolves, their raid spoiled, melted back into the darkness. The silence that descended was deafening, broken only by their own ragged breaths and the nervous stamping of the sheep. Caleb walked over to where Alara stood leaning against the fence, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "I am fine," she said, though her arm was throbbing. "We did not lose any—" "No," he said, his gaze sweeping the paddock. "We did not." He looked back at her, and his eyes fell on her arm. "You are bleeding." She looked down and saw for the first time the long, ragged tear in the sleeve of her nightdress, and the dark stain of blood spreading across the fabric. "It is just a scratch." "Let me see it," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He led her into the warmth of the barn. He lit another lantern, and the space was filled with a soft, golden glow. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a hay bale. He went to a supply cabinet and came back with a tin of salve and some clean cloths. Alara sat, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline of the attack. She held out her arm, trying to hide the tremor in her hand. He gently took her arm, his touch surprisingly careful, and pushed the torn fabric of her sleeve higher to get a better look at the wound. And then he froze. The gash from the fence was angry and red, a fresh line of pain on her skin. But it was what lay beneath it, and what the torn sleeve revealed, that had stolen the breath from his lungs. There, on the soft flesh of her upper arm, was a scar. It was not a scar from an accident. It was old, the skin raised and puckered, a jagged, ugly mark that had been deliberately burned into her. It was a brand. In the steady, unforgiving light of the lantern, he could make out the shape of it, a stylized letter S intertwined with a C. The rancher looked and was speechless. The air in the barn grew thick and heavy. The symbol was seared not just into her skin, but into his memory as well. He had seen it before, years ago, carved into the gatepost of a burned-out homestead. It was the mark of Silas Kane, a name that decent folk in the territory only whispered, a name synonymous with ruthless ambition, cruelty, and murder. Kane had been a land grabber, a man who took what he wanted and destroyed anyone who stood in his way. He had vanished years ago, driven out of the territory, or so the story went, after a final, brutal crime. A homesteader named Miller and his young wife, murdered for their land and water rights. The official report, signed by a territorial marshal, had been clear. The homestead was burned to the ground. There were no survivors. Caleb stared at the brand on Alara's arm, and a cold, sickening realization washed over him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He was not looking at a stranger, a woman with a mysterious past. He was looking at a ghost. He was looking at the woman everyone believed had died in the flames with her husband. Alara watched his face, saw the color drain from it, saw the way his eyes were fixed on her scar with an expression of stunned horror. She felt a familiar, icy shame creep through her veins. He was disgusted. He was repulsed by the ugly truth of her, the mark of her ruin. She began to pull her arm away, a sob catching in her throat, her entire body rigid with humiliation. She had known this would happen. She had known that no one could look upon her shame without flinching. But Caleb's reaction was not what she expected. He did not let go of her arm. His fingers, which had gone slack with shock, tightened ever so slightly. A gesture that was not confining, but anchoring. He looked from the brand to her face, to the terror and shame in her eyes. He saw her trembling fingers trying to take the needle and thread she had picked up to stitch her own wound. He did not say a word. He could not. What words were there for this? Instead, he gently, carefully, took the needle from her trembling fingers. His touch was different now. The professional distance was gone, replaced by something else entirely. It was a touch filled with a dawning, terrible understanding, a profound respect for the unimaginable strength it must have taken for her to still be breathing, and a fierce, nascent protectiveness that rose in his chest like a sudden, hot fire. With a surgeon's care, he began to stitch the fresh wound on her arm, his large, calloused hands moving with an impossible gentleness. Ilara sat frozen, too stunned to move, as he tended to her. She had misinterpreted his silence, his stillness. She saw only revulsion, the same reaction she had feared and expected from the world. The fragile, unspoken connection they had built over the past weeks felt as if it had been irrevocably severed. The chasm between them now seemed as wide and as deep as the canyon that cut through the north pasture. But in reality, for Caleb Blackwood, the chasm had vanished. In one terrible, silent moment, his entire perception of her had been shattered and remade. He finally understood her fear, her guardedness, her desperate, hunted search for anonymity. She was not a woman with a shameful secret. She was a survivor of an unspeakable tragedy. And in the quiet, lantern-lit barn, a silent vow took root in his soul. He did not know what the future held, but he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he would not let the world hurt her again. The days that followed the night of the wolf attack were marked by a subtle but profound shift. The knowledge of what Ilara had survived settled deep inside Caleb, altering the very gravity of his world. He did not speak of the brand on her arm. To do so would be to name a horror that she had fought so hard to bury. Instead, he became her silent guardian, a watchful presence on the periphery of her life. The change was not in his words, for he was as sparing with them as ever, but in his actions. A week after the attack, they rode into Redemption for supplies. It was a necessary trip, and one Ilara had dreaded. As they were leaving the mercantile, their arms laden with sacks of flour and coffee, Martha Holt and two of her companions stepped out of the dressmaker's shop. Blocking their path, Mrs. Holt's eyes, small and hard as pebbles, fixed on Ilara. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she said, her voice carrying down the boardwalk. "I am surprised you have the nerve to show your face here, after the shame you brought upon Mr. Henderson's establishment." Ilara froze, the blood draining from her face. She felt the familiar, suffocating shame rise in her throat. She expected Caleb to walk on, to pretend he did not hear, to distance himself from her as any sensible man would. Instead, he stopped. He did not say a word. He slowly turned his head and looked at Martha Holt. His gaze was flat, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a look that spoke of winters that kill and of a patience that could outlast stone. He held her stare for 3 long, silent seconds. "Mrs." Holt's smug smile faltered, and a flicker of unease crossed her face. She took an involuntary step back. Clearing the way, Caleb gave a slight nod, a silent dismissal, and then looked at Ilara. "Let us go," he said, his voice as calm as a frozen river. He walked beside her to the wagon, taking the heaviest sacks from her arms. As they rode out of town, the silence between them was thick with unspoken meaning. He had stood for her. He had defended her without a single word. His protection continued back at the ranch. He found reasons to work near her cabin, mending a section of fence she did not know was broken, checking on the water level in the creek that ran nearby. He was a shadow she was always aware of, a presence that was not intrusive, but constant. One morning, she found a rifle propped against the wall of her cabin, a full box of cartridges sitting beside it on the porch. She looked toward the main house and saw him watching from his doorway. He met her questioning gaze and simply stated, his voice carrying on the crisp morning air, "This land is not safe for anyone alone." Ilara was deeply wary of this change. Her experience with men had been a bitter education in betrayal and abandonment. Kindness, she had learned, was often a mask for something else, a currency used to purchase a debt she would later be forced to pay. She could not comprehend Caleb's motives. Did he pity her? Did he want something from her? The questions circled in her mind, and she responded by retreating even further into herself, her conversations with him becoming even more brief and functional. She remained distant, but she could not deny the profound effect his quiet guardianship was having on her. In the small, sturdy cabin he had given her, she felt a sense of security she had not known since she was a child. The nightmares that had plagued her for years, filled with fire and smoke and the face of a merciless man, began to recede. The nights were no longer a territory of terror she had to survive. She started sleeping through until dawn, waking not to the frantic pounding of her own heart, but to the gentle sound of birdsong in the cottonwoods outside her window. His presence, which her mind feared, had become a balm to her wounded spirit. The tension between them, a fragile cord of unspoken grief and burgeoning awareness, pulled tighter with each passing day. It was built not in grand declarations, but in small, quiet moments that held the weight of entire conversations. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, he found her by the creek that cut through his property. She was sitting on a smooth, flat rock, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The reasons for her tears could have been anything: the memory of a life stolen, the cruelty of the town, the simple, crushing weight of her loneliness. Caleb did not ask. He knew that some sorrows were too deep to be given voice. He walked not to her, but to another rock a short distance away, and sat. He did not speak. He simply existed in the space with her, his solid, steady presence a silent testament that she was not alone in her grief. He was an anchor in her turbulent sea of memory. He sat with her as the sky deepened from purple to a velvety, star-dusted black, as the sounds of the day gave way to the chirping of crickets and the low hoot of an owl. When her tears finally subsided and her shoulders grew still, he stood, walked over to her, and wordlessly offered her his clean, folded handkerchief. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and whispered a thank you so quiet he felt it more than he heard it. Another day, they rode out to the farthest corner of the ranch to repair a stretch of fence damaged by a rock slide. The sky was clear when they started, but the weather in the high country was a fickle beast. Dark clouds boiled up over the mountains with astonishing speed, and a cold, driving rain began to fall. They were miles from the main house, soaked through in minutes. "There is an old line shack over that ridge," Caleb shouted over the drumming of the rain. "We can wait it out there." The shack was a tiny, one-room structure, little more than a pile of logs with a roof, but it was dry. They tethered the horses under a small overhang and huddled inside, the space so small their shoulders almost touched. The chill had sunk deep into their bones. Caleb managed to start a small, smoky fire in the dilapidated stone fireplace. They sat on the dirt floor, shoulder to shoulder, sharing a blanket from his saddle roll, watching the rain lash against the single grimy window pane. The forced proximity, the shared warmth, and the isolation of the storm created an overwhelming emotional intimacy. The silence in the tiny shack was different from the comfortable silence of their work. It was charged, heavy with all the things they had never said. It was Caleb who finally broke it. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice low and rough, his gaze fixed on the struggling flames. "My wife." Ilara's breath caught. He had never spoken of his family. "And we had a son, Jacob." He had his mother's smile. A pained expression crossed Caleb's face, a deep, raw grief that he had kept hidden from the world. The fever took them both in the same week. Jacob went first. Sarah held on for 2 more days. There was nothing I could do, nothing. He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air, raw and painful. He had given her a piece of his shattered heart, an offering of trust that was both a burden and a gift. Ilara felt a powerful urge to comfort him, but she did not know how. Instead, she offered him a small, safe piece of herself in return. "My father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He used to take me walking in the meadows behind our house. He taught me the names of all the wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, bluebells, wild asters." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "He said that if you knew the name of a thing, it could never be truly lost to you." It was a tiny offering of trust, a memory from before her life had been torn apart. But for them, in that small, rain-lashed shack, it was monumental. They were no longer just a rancher and his hired hand. They were 2 people who had looked into the abyss of loss and had shown each other their scars. In the weeks that followed, Caleb began making more frequent trips to distant towns, using his cattle business as a pretext. He would ride to places like Miles City or even further north, places where men gathered and stories were traded like currency. In dusty saloons and quiet general stores, he would discreetly ask questions, his manner casual, his inquiries cloaked in discussions of land prices and cattle breeds. He asked about Silas Kane. He learned that the official story was a lie, a tale spun by a bought and paid-for marshal. Kane had not been driven from the territory. He had simply grown smarter, more powerful, moving his operations into the world of legitimate business, using lawyers and contracts instead of guns, though the threat of violence always lay just beneath the surface. Caleb pieced together the true story of what had happened to Ilara's family. Her husband, Daniel Miller, had owned a small but prosperous homestead with rich water rights that Kane had coveted. When Daniel refused to sell, Kane and his men had come in the night. They had murdered Daniel and left Ilara for dead in the fire that consumed her home. They had taken everything from her. The knowledge settled in Caleb's gut like a cold, hard stone, solidifying his silent vow into a purpose. The cattle drive was a necessary autumn task, moving the herd from the high summer pastures down to the sheltered valleys for the winter. It was hard, dusty work, lasting several days. For Ilara, who had proven herself a capable rider, it was a chance to earn her keep and to be out under the vast, open sky, away from the prying eyes of redemption. On the final night of the drive, they made camp by a small, gurgling stream. The cattle were quiet. The day's work was done. They sat by the crackling campfire, the flames pushing back the immense darkness of the prairie night. Above them, the sky was a black velvet blanket strewn with 1,000,000 glittering diamonds, the vulnerability and trust they had built, moment by quiet moment. In the rain-soaked shack and by the tearful creek, finally overflowed. Caleb looked at her, the firelight dancing in her eyes, turning her hair to spun gold. He saw the strength in the set of her jaw, the resilience that had allowed her to survive the unthinkable. He saw not the victim of Silas Kane, but the woman who had refused to be destroyed, the woman who had taught him what true courage was. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 7 long years suddenly felt unbearable, and it was eclipsed by a burgeoning affection that he could no longer deny. He leaned forward, his movement slow, tentative. He lifted a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her skin for a bare second. Her breath hitched, but she did not pull away. He saw the question in her eyes, and a flicker of something he had not seen there before. Hope. He leaned in and kissed her. It was tentative at first, a soft pressure of his lips on hers, a question asked without words. She was still, her lips unresponsive for a moment, and he thought he had made a terrible mistake. But then, she let out a small, shuddering breath and kissed him back. It was a desperate, hopeful gesture, A lifetime of fear and loneliness and longing poured into a single, hesitant touch. Encouraged, his kiss deepened, becoming a current of all the pent-up emotion he had kept locked away, his grief, his solitude, and the powerful, unexpected affection he felt for this broken, beautiful, impossibly strong woman. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated hope in a life that had been defined by tragedy for them both. Under the vast, indifferent gaze of the stars, by the warmth of a small, temporary fire, two lonely souls found a flicker of light in each other, a promise that survival was not the end of the story, but, perhaps, just the beginning. The fragile hope born under a canopy of stars was as fleeting as a desert sunrise. It was a warmth that Caleb and Alara carried back with them from the cattle drive, a quiet, tentative glow that lit the corners of their solitary lives. For a few weeks, a semblance of peace settled over the ranch. They worked side by side, the silence between them now filled with a comfortable intimacy, the memory of their kiss a constant, unspoken presence. But the West was a place that had little patience for peace, and the serpent they had thought long vanished was about to uncoil in the heart of their world. The change arrived in redemption not with the thunder of hooves and the crack of gunfire, but with the quiet, inexorable progress of 3 gleaming new wagons. A group of men in city suits and polished boots stepped onto the dusty boardwalk, their presence as alien as a steam locomotive in a horse pasture. They were surveyors with their tripods and chains, and agents with their leather briefcases and confident smiles. They spoke of the future, of a new land development company, of a railroad spur and the prosperity it would bring to the valley. Their leader was a man who commanded attention without ever raising his voice. He was handsome, in his mid-40s, with silvering temples and a smile that seemed both genuine and predatory. His eyes, however, were as cold and gray as a winter sky, missing any hint of the warmth his smile promised. He introduced himself to the town council and the awestruck merchants as Mr. Silas Kane. He had returned, not as the outlaw of whispered legend, but as a legitimate captain of industry, his past crimes whitewashed by money and time. He was cloaked in an air of respectability, and he had come to claim the valley he had always believed was his. Alara was in town that day, a rare trip she had made alone. She felt a newfound confidence, a lightness in her step she had not known in years. She was standing outside the mercantile, deciding on a spool of thread, when she saw him. He was across the street, speaking with the mayor, his posture relaxed, his gestures expansive. For a moment, her mind did not register him. He was a stranger, just one of the new men. Then he turned his head, and the afternoon sun caught the precise angle of his face, and the world stopped. It was him, older, more refined, but it was the same man from her nightmares, the same cold eyes, the same cruel line to his mouth that his smile could never quite hide. The spool of thread slipped from her numb fingers and rolled into the dust. The sounds of the town, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a passing wagon, the murmur of conversation, all faded into a deafening roar in her ears. She was paralyzed, a rabbit caught in the gaze of a snake. Every cell in her body screamed, a silent, primal shriek of pure terror. All the progress she had made, the nights she had slept without fear, the fragile trust she had built with Caleb, all of it shattered into a million pieces. The past was not the past. It was here, standing in the sunlit street of redemption, wearing a fine suit and a charming smile. Her paralysis broke, and a single, overriding instinct took over. Flight. She turned and ran. She did not bother with the horse and buggy she had driven into town. She ran on foot, out of the town and onto the long, dusty road that led to the ranch, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She did not feel the stones under her thin shoes or the sun beating down on her head. She saw only his face, felt only the icy grip of a terror she thought she had outrun forever. Caleb was in the barn, repairing a harness. When he saw her running up the road, He had never seen anyone run with such frantic, mindless panic. He dropped the harness and met her as she stumbled into the yard, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. He reached for her, but she flinched away, her eyes wide with a horror so profound it chilled him to the bone. She did not seem to see him. She ran past him, into her small cabin, and slammed the door. He followed, his own heart beginning to pound with a cold dread. He pushed the door open and found her in a state of frantic chaos. She was throwing her meager belongings, a spare dress, a brush, a small book, into a canvas sack. Her movements were jerky, uncoordinated, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "Ilara," he said, his voice sharp. "What is it? What happened?" She looked up at him, but her eyes looked through him, seeing something else, something only she could see. "Please, not again," she begged, her voice breaking, shattering into a desperate, pleading whisper. "You do not understand. We have to leave. He will destroy everything. He will destroy you." The words from the title of the story he had been trying to piece together in his mind had finally been spoken, and they were 1,000 times more terrible than he could have imagined. His confusion hardened into a sudden, sickening certainty. "Who? Ilara? Who is in town?" "Kane," she breathed, the name a poisoned thing on her lips. "Silas Kane." The name landed in the quiet cabin like a physical blow. A cold, hard knot of anger formed in Caleb's stomach, a rage so pure and so deep it was almost calming. So, the devil had come home. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and gently but firmly took her hands. Stilling their frantic packing, he held her, pulling her against his chest, feeling the violent tremors that racked her body. "You are not running anywhere," he told her, his voice low and firm, a bedrock of absolute resolve. He held her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "This is your home. Do you hear me? This is your home. I will not let him touch you." He was making a vow, not just to her, but to the ghosts of his own past, to the memory of the family he had been unable to protect. This time would be different. Silas Kane did not recognize Ilara at first. In his memory, she was a scrawny, terrified teenager. The woman who now lived on Caleb Blackwood's ranch was a stranger to him. His focus, for the time being, was purely on business. His surveyors had mapped the entire valley, and their findings confirmed what he already knew. The Blackwood Ranch was the key. It held the most fertile land, the highest grade timber, and, most importantly, it controlled the main source of water for the entire region. To control the valley, he had to control the Blackwood Ranch. He began his campaign of intimidation with the subtlety of a spider weaving its web. He did not ride up with armed men. Instead, a polite, well-dressed lawyer appeared at Caleb's door with a stack of official-looking documents. The papers claimed a dispute over the southern boundary line, citing a previously undiscovered survey from decades ago that, if proven valid, would cede Caleb's primary water source to Kane's development company. It was a legal fiction, a fabrication designed to bleed him dry with court costs and lawyers' fees. When Caleb threw the man off his property, Kane sent surveyors who began driving stakes into Caleb's land, their presence a constant, silent provocation. Veiled threats were delivered by his agents in town, friendly warnings about the dangers of standing in the way of progress, hints about how easily accidents could happen in such a wild country. The town of Redemption, desperate for the prosperity Silas Kane promised, turned on Caleb with a swift and brutal pragmatism. The whispers that had once been aimed at Ilara now included him. He was a stubborn fool, an obstacle. Martha Holt spoke loudly in the mercantile of his selfishness, of how he was denying the entire valley a prosperous future for his own selfish reasons. The prejudice Ilara had faced now extended to them both. They were shunned, isolated. The blacksmith suddenly found himself too busy to shoe Caleb's horses. Mr. Henderson's prices for their supplies mysteriously doubled. They were completely alone, adrift in a sea of hostility. Their only allies were a few old, stubborn ranchers who had known Caleb's father and who shared his distrust of smooth-talking men from the city. The most steadfast among them was Jedediah Mills, a wiry, cantankerous old man with a fierce sense of loyalty and a deep-seated hatred for bullies. "Cain's a rattler in a fancy waistcoat," Jed had told Caleb, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Do not turn your back on him." The external pressure, the constant threat, did not break Caleb and Alara. It forged them together, melting away the last of their tentative uncertainty. Their love, born in quiet moments and sealed with a single kiss, was no longer a fragile thing. It became their only source of strength, their sanctuary in the storm. The fear that had once made Alara flinch from his touch was replaced by a desperate need for the safety she found only in his arms. His grief, once a solitary burden, was now a shared weight, lightened by her presence. Their new reality demanded a new kind of preparation. One afternoon, Caleb took the rifle he had given her and led her out to a quiet clearing. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Not just to hold it, but to use it." He taught her how to shoot. The lessons were intimate and intense, a preparation for a war he prayed would not come. He stood behind her, his large frame shielding hers, his hands covering her smaller ones on the stock of the rifle. He showed her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. His chest was pressed against her back, and his low voice was a steady murmur in her ear. "Breathe out slow," he instructed. "Become still, just for a second. That is all it takes." The necessary physical contact was charged with an unspoken passion, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of the encroaching darkness. When she fired the first shot, the kick of the rifle jarring her, he held her steady. When she hit the tin can he had set on a distant fence post, a small, triumphant smile touched her lips, and he felt a surge of pride and a deep, aching tenderness. The breaking point came a week later, a tragic event that solidified their resolve and stripped away any illusion that this conflict could be won with lawyers or stubbornness. Jedediah Mills was found dead at the bottom of a steep, rocky ravine on the edge of his property. His supply wagon was overturned beside him, its contents scattered. The town's sheriff, a man who had shown himself to be squarely in Silas Cain's pocket, ruled it an accident, a tragic mishap. He had declared the old man must have lost control of his team. But Caleb and Alara knew better. Caleb rode out to the site of the accident and saw what the sheriff had chosen to ignore. He saw the tracks of 2 other horses, shod with a type of shoe not used by any of the local ranchers. He saw the deep, unnatural gouges in the earth where the wagon had been deliberately forced off the narrow trail, and he saw the look of terror frozen on his old friend's face. It was not an accident. It was a message, delivered with cold, brutal efficiency. This is what happens to those who stand with Caleb Blackwood. That night, the glimmer of hope they had felt after their first kiss was completely overshadowed by the certainty of violence. They sat in Caleb's cabin, the silence heavy with grief and a dawning, terrible clarity. Alara looked at Caleb, her eyes clear and steady. The terror that had consumed her was gone, burned away and replaced by a core of steel. "I cannot run any more," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I ran once, and it did not matter. He found me. If I run again, he will just hurt someone else. He will hurt you." She finally understood that she could not escape her past. She had to turn and face it, not just for herself, but for the memory of Jed, and for the man who now stood beside her. Caleb looked at her, at the incredible strength that had risen from the ashes of her fear. He knew she was right. His own purpose had also crystallized. This was no longer just a fight to defend his land from a greedy developer. It was a fight for justice. It was a reckoning for the life of Jedediah Mills. And it was a final, long overdue accounting for what Silas Cain had done to Alara and her husband all those years ago. He could not just defend. He had to attack. They had to stop being the victims. They had to become the thing Silas Kane feared most, the ones who would see him fall. The decision to fight back was a quiet declaration of war, a vow made in the shadow of a friend's fresh grave. But their enemy was not a man who engaged in honorable battle. Silas Kane preferred to watch from a distance, to pull strings and observe as his plans slowly strangled the life from his opponents. For weeks, he seemed content to let the pressure of his legal challenges and the town's ostracism do his work for him. He was a patient predator, and he was intrigued by the prey that refused to cower. He had become particularly intrigued by the woman at Caleb Blackwood's side. He had seen her in town, the day Blackwood had stared down Martha Holt. He had noted her defiance, a spark of spirit in a woman he had assumed was just another homesteader's drab wife. There was something familiar about the set of her jaw, the line of her throat. He began to watch the Blackwood ranch from a distance, using a spyglass from a high ridge that overlooked the property. One afternoon, he saw them. Caleb and the woman were working together, repairing a section of fence destroyed in the last storm. She moved with a fluid grace and a surprising strength, handing Caleb tools, holding posts steady as he drove them into the hard earth. The wind caught her hair, pulling it back from her face, and for a long, clear moment, her profile was perfectly illuminated. Silas froze, the spyglass steady in his hand. The years melted away, and he was no longer looking at a ranch hand's woman. He was looking at the ghost of Abigail Miller. No, that was not her name. Ilara, that was it. The girl he had left for dead in a burning homestead. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. This was not a complication. This was not a loose end he had failed to tie up. This was a prize he had failed to claim. The realization filled him with a predatory excitement, a thrill far more potent than the simple acquisition of land. He remembered her terror, the way she had fought him. The memory was intoxicating. To find her here, alive and defiant, at the side of the very man who stood in his way, was a twist of fate so perfect it could only be an invitation. He would not just take the land. He would take her, too. He would finish what he had started all those years ago and break her so completely that all that would be left was his mark upon her soul. He knew he had to separate her from Blackwood's protection. He waited, his patience absolute, until he saw his opportunity. A few days later, he watched Caleb ride out toward the high pastures, a long day's work ahead of him. Ilara was alone. He rode down from the ridge, his approach casual, as if he were merely a neighbor out for a ride. He found her by the creek, gathering wild mint. She heard the sound of his horse's hooves and looked up, a basket clutched in her hand. When she saw him, the basket fell, its contents spilling across the damp earth. The color drained from her face, and the terror he remembered so fondly returned to her eyes. "Ilara," he said, his voice a soft, silken thing. He swung down from his saddle, moving with a cat-like grace. "It is Ilara, is it not? I must confess, I did not recognize you at first. You have grown into a beautiful woman." She could not speak, could not move. Her feet were rooted to the spot, her entire being consumed by the monstrous presence before her. He took a step closer, his cold eyes roaming over her. "I often wondered what became of you," he said, his tone conversational, as if they were old acquaintances. "A shame about your husband, Daniel. He was a stubborn man. Stubbornness is a fatal flaw in this country." He paused, letting the casual cruelty of his words sink in. "He screamed your name at the end. Did you know that?" A strangled sob escaped her lips. He smiled. "But we need not dwell on the unpleasant past," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We should speak of the future, your future." He gestured vaguely toward the ranch house. "This man, Blackwood, he is stubborn, too. I see the same foolish pride in him that Daniel had, and I would hate to see his story end the same way." He let the threat hang in the air for a long moment before delivering his ultimatum. "So, you have a choice. You can convince your rancher to be sensible, have him sign the papers, sell me his land, and walk away. And you, my dear Alara, you will come with me. I will take care of you. You will have everything you could ever desire." He reached out and lightly touched a strand of her hair. She flinched as if his touch were a hot iron. "Or," he said, his voice turning hard as flint, "you can refuse, and you can watch as I destroy him. I will not be as quick with him as I was with Daniel. I will peel his life away, piece by piece, his land, his cattle, his pride, and when he has nothing left, when he is broken and begging in the dirt, I will kill him, and his death, like Daniel's, will be your fault." He expected her to weep, to beg, to collapse. He had seen it 100 times before, but something inside Alara, something forged in the fires of her past and tempered by the quiet strength she had found with Caleb, refused to break. The terror was still there, a cold, sickening knot in her stomach, but another feeling was rising to meet it, a pure, incandescent hatred. This man had taken her love, her home, her name. He would not take another. She lifted her chin, her eyes, though filled with fear, meeting his without wavering. "I will see you in hell before I let you touch him," she said, her voice low and trembling, but filled with a core of steel he had not anticipated. His eyes widened slightly in surprise, and then his smile returned, wider and more predatory than before. This was even better than he had imagined. "So be it," he whispered. Her defiance had not deterred him. It had sealed her fate and fueled his obsession. Silas Kane was true to his word. The attacks on the ranch escalated, moving from legal harassment to outright sabotage. One morning, Caleb found a dozen of his best cattle lying dead near the creek, their bodies bloated, white foam frothing at their mouths. The water, their lifeblood, had been poisoned. The financial loss was staggering, but the spiritual blow was worse. It was an act of profound violation, a desecration of the land he loved. 2 weeks later, the next attack came. In the dead of night, a thunderous roar woke Caleb and Alara. They ran outside to see a terrifying sight. A massive portion of their herd, hundreds of cattle, stampeding wildly across the valley floor, their eyes wide with panic. A half-dozen riders, their faces obscured by bandanas, were firing pistols into the air, driving the herd directly toward the northern fence line. The cattle crashed through the sturdy fencing as if it were made of matchsticks, scattering into the wilderness, many of them lost for good. The stampede had served another purpose. Ben, a young ranch hand Caleb had hired for the season, a loyal boy of 17, had been sleeping in the line shack near that fence line. The cattle had overrun the small structure, trampling it into splinters. They found him in the wreckage, his leg crushed, his body a mass of bruises. He was alive, but barely. The pressure was immense, a calculated campaign designed to break them financially, to crush their spirits under a relentless wave of loss and violence. Caleb sat by the fire late that night, after the doctor had come and gone, his face a grim, stony mask. He saw the toll this was taking on Alara. Despite her defiance at the creek, the constant fear had returned to her eyes. She started at every sound, and the nightmares had returned with a vengeance. He looked at his life, at the ranch his father had built, at the young man now lying maimed in his bunkhouse, at the woman he loved living in a state of constant terror. The weight of it all was crushing him. "We should leave," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Alara, who had been staring into the flames, looked up, her expression one of shocked disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said we should leave," he repeated, his voice flat. "He will not stop. He will kill us both. Alara, I can sell the ranch. We can take the money and go somewhere he will never find us. California, Oregon, anywhere." He was offering her the very thing she had once begged for, a chance to run, but now it felt like a surrender, a betrayal. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "We cannot We said we would fight." "Fight with what?" he shot back, his frustration and fear boiling over. "He owns the law. He has more men, more money. Jed is dead. Ben is half dead. How many more people have to get hurt before I accept that I cannot protect you here?" Her face crumpled, and the raw, emotional argument he had unknowingly started tore open the deepest of her wounds. "So that is it?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You want to run because of me? Because you think I am weak?" "No, I want to run because I love you, and I cannot stand to see what he is doing to you." "What you cannot stand is my past," she retorted, her voice breaking with a despair that came from the very core of her being. "Do you not see? It does not matter where we go. I am the one he wants. I am the one who brings this. I am cursed, Caleb. Everything I touch, everyone I love, they are destroyed. Daniel, Jed, and now you. I bring only death." It was a moment of profound darkness, a confession of the deepest, most terrifying belief she held about herself. She saw herself not as a victim, but as a plague. Caleb stared at her, his own anger dissolving in the face of her immense pain. He crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. He held her and made her look at him, his gaze intense, willing her to see the truth. "Do not ever say that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are not a curse. You are a survivor. Do you have any idea of the strength it took for you to live through what he did to you? To get up every day and keep breathing? You are the strongest person I have ever known." He held her tighter, refusing to let her pull away. "Our love for each other is not a weakness. Elara, it is the one thing he cannot understand, and it is the one thing he cannot break. He thinks he can destroy us by taking my land, my cattle, but he is wrong." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "Losing this ranch is nothing," he whispered. "Losing you would be the end of my world." His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the abyss of her despair. She looked at him, at the fierce, unwavering love in his eyes, and she finally allowed herself to believe. She was not a curse. She was a survivor, and she was loved. Their love and desire, forged in tragedy and cemented in this moment of shared desperation, overflowed. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to his bed. They made love for the first time, an act that was so much more than physical. For Elara, it was a reclamation of a body that had been a source of shame and trauma, a defiant rediscovery of pleasure and tenderness. For Caleb, it was an affirmation of a future he had never thought he would have. In the face of death and destruction, they chose life. They chose each other, their bodies and souls locking together in a silent, powerful vow. Afterward, they lay in the quiet darkness, their limbs tangled, the storm of their emotions having finally passed, leaving a calm, clear certainty in its wake. They knew what they had to do. The time for defending was over. The time for reacting to his attacks was done. "We have to stop him," she whispered into the darkness. "I know," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble against her ear. "Not just for us, for everyone he has ever hurt. They would no longer be Silas Kane's victims. They would be his downfall." The aftermath of their decision was not a flurry of frantic action, but a descent into a cold, deliberate calm. The fire of their love had been forged into the hard steel of purpose. They knew they could not beat Silas Kane with force. He had more men and fewer scruples. They knew they could not beat him with the law. He had purchased it like any other commodity. Their only weapons were the ones he could not comprehend, their intimate knowledge of the unforgiving land, and his own bottomless greed. Their plan was born in the quiet hours before dawn, sketched out on the dusty surface of the kitchen table. Caleb knew of a place on the far northern edge of his property, a narrow, treacherous canyon he called the Devil's Jaw. It was a geologist's nightmare, a place of crumbling rock and unpredictable slides, but its quartz-laced stone had always held the glint of possibility. It was the perfect place for a trap. The bait would be silver, Caleb rode to a town 50 miles east, a place where he was not known and Kane's influence was thin. He went to the assayer's office with a leather pouch heavy with rocks he had carefully salted with a small amount of silver dust purchased from a weary prospector. He made a show of secrecy, his hushed conversation with the assayer just loud enough to be overheard by the other men in the office. He left with a certified document that declared a promising silver content in his samples. He knew Kane had eyes and ears everywhere. The rumor of a silver strike on the Blackwood Ranch would reach him within days. It was a lure so potent, so perfectly tailored to Kane's avarice, that he would be unable to resist. The bait was set. The news spread through the territory like a prairie fire, a whispered rumor that grew into a roar. Caleb Blackwood, the stubborn fool, had been sitting on a silver mine all along. Silas Kane heard the news and laughed, a cold, humorless sound. It was the final, perfect piece of his puzzle. Blackwood had been defiant not out of foolish pride, but because he was hiding a fortune. The realization sealed Caleb's fate in Kane's mind. He would not just take the land now. He would take the silver that lay beneath it. He did not bother with his lawyers. This was not a matter for contracts and courts. This was a matter of swift, final acquisition. Believing that Caleb would be at the remote canyon, distracted and vulnerable as he worked his new claim. Silas gathered his core group of men. There were 6 of them, hard cases who had followed him for years, their loyalty bought with blood and coin. They rode out from redemption under the cover of a moonless night, their saddlebags filled with ammunition and their hearts with murder. They intended to ambush Caleb Blackwood, seize his claim, and leave no witnesses to the transaction. The Devil's Jaw was even more menacing in the pre-dawn gloom. It was a deep scar in the earth, with towering rock walls that seemed to lean in toward each other, blocking out the sky. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the scuttling of loose gravel under their horses' hooves. It was a place that felt ancient and hostile, a place that did not suffer fools gladly. Caleb and Alara were already there, waiting. They had spent the last day preparing. Alara was not hidden away at the ranch. She was a crucial part of the plan. Caleb had led her up a steep, hidden trail to a high ridge that overlooked the canyon's entrance. From her vantage point, she had a clear line of sight down the entire length of the narrow passage. She lay on a flat, rocky outcrop, the rifle Caleb had given her resting steady on a pile of stones, its cold metal a reassuring weight in her hands. She was terrified, but her fear was a sharp, clean thing now, a tool to be used, not a poison to paralyze her. Down below, Caleb was a ghost in the shadows. He had used his knowledge of the canyon to lay his traps. He had loosened a massive pile of scree on the canyon wall, held in place by a single, thick rope. He had scouted the narrowest passages, the blind corners, the places where the echoes of a single gunshot would sound like a dozen. He was not a soldier, but he was a man defending his home, his love, and his life, and that made him infinitely more dangerous than the hired guns who were coming for him. The fight began not with a glorious shout, but with the quiet, deadly twang of a rope being severed. As Silas and his men rode into the canyon, Caleb, hidden behind a rockfall, cut the rope holding back the scree. A river of rock and gravel cascaded down the canyon wall. Not a massive, crushing avalanche, but enough to block the entrance, trapping them inside and sending their horses into a panicked frenzy. The canyon erupted into chaos. Gunshots echoed and re-echoed off the stone walls, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. The fight was not a noble shootout. It was a desperate, brutal, and terrifying struggle for survival. Caleb used the terrain as his primary weapon. He moved through the shadows, a phantom in the landscape he knew as well as the lines on his own hand. He used the confusing echoes to draw their fire, to separate them. One of Kane's men, chasing a phantom gunshot, rounded a blind corner and met Caleb's knife. Another, trying to scale the canyon wall for a better vantage point, was picked off by a single, steady shot from Alara's rifle on the ridge. She did not hesitate. Her hands were steady, her breathing even, just as Caleb had taught her. She was not just a survivor anymore. She was a protector. One by one, Caleb used the canyon to whittle down their numbers, the claustrophobic terrain turning their superior numbers into a liability. The glorious ambush had turned into a meat grinder. The climax came down to a desperate confrontation between the three of them. Caleb, in taking down the last of Cain's men, had been shot, a searing line of pain across his ribs. He was bleeding, his movement slowed. Silas Cain, his fine suit now torn and filthy, his face a mask of furious disbelief, saw his chance. He cornered Caleb against a sheer rock wall. "You stubborn fool!" Silas snarled, raising his pistol, his cold eyes gleaming with triumph. "All of this could have been yours. Now, you will die in the dirt with nothing." Just as Silas was about to finish him, the crack of Ilara's rifle echoed from the ridge above. The shot was not perfect. It was the shot of a woman under incredible pressure, a shot born of love and desperation. It did not kill him, but her bullet tore through the flesh of his shoulder, spinning him around and causing his own shot to go wide, striking the rock wall beside Caleb's head. The impact of the bullet knocked Silas off his feet, his pistol clattering onto the rocks. The opening was all Caleb needed. He lunged, ignoring the fire in his side, and slammed his body into Cain's, driving him to the ground. The fight was no longer one of guns, but of pure, brutal strength. They rolled in the dust and gravel, two men locked in a primal struggle. But Silas, his arm useless, his arrogance shattered, was no match for Caleb's raw, desperate power. Caleb gained the upper hand, his fist connecting with Cain's jaw, dazing him. Just then, Ilara appeared, scrambling down the last of the rocky slope, the rifle held at her side. She stood over the two men, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fire Silas had never seen before. He looked up at her from the ground, beaten and bleeding, and he saw not the terrified, broken girl he had once victimized, but a woman of immense and terrible strength, a woman who had taken back her own power. She was his judge, his jury, and the face of his final, fatal mistake. He scrambled backward, away from Caleb, his good hand scrabbling for his lost pistol. His eyes were wild with a dawning, animal terror. As he pushed himself up against the canyon wall, his movement, his weight, dislodged a precariously balanced boulder above him, one that had been loosened in the initial rock slide. There was a low groan, a shifting of stone, and then the final act of justice was delivered. It came not from a hangman's noose, nor from a righteous bullet, but from the harsh, unforgiving landscape itself. The boulder broke free, and Silas Cain, the man who sought to conquer the brutal world of the West, was consumed by it. The aftermath was quiet and somber. The silence that fell over the devil's jaw was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind. The victory did not feel triumphant. It felt like the end of a long, painful fever. With Silas Cain and his men gone, their reign of terror was over. The truth of his crimes, of Jed's murder and the endless campaign of intimidation, came to light, piece by agonizing piece. The town of redemption was left to reckon with its own cowardice, its willingness to trade its soul for a promise of prosperity. But Caleb and Ilara were not concerned with the town's redemption. They had found their own. Weeks later, the first real snow of winter had dusted the high peaks, and the harshness of the land was softening into the quiet peace of the changing seasons. They stood together on the windswept hill that overlooked the ranch, beside the three simple graves that had once been a monument to Caleb's solitude. He was mending the fence that enclosed the small plot, his left arm still bandaged, a pale strip of white against his sun-darkened skin. His movements were slow but steady, the familiar work a healing balm. Ilara came up the hill, carrying a dipper of cool water for him. She stood beside him, and they looked out over the valley. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the lower pasture. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, The silence between them was no longer one of grief or unspoken tension, but of a deep, abiding peace that had been earned with blood and courage. The setting sun bathed the harsh landscape in a soft, golden light, transforming the rugged plains into a place of breathtaking beauty. They did not speak of the future, of the vows they might make, or the children they might have. They did not need to. The future was not a destination to be discussed, but a landscape to be lived in. It stretched out before them, as vast and as hopeful as the Montana sky, a life they had earned through tragedy, a life they would build together with a love that had proven stronger than any prejudice, stronger than any fear, and as enduring as the land itself. Thank you for listening to our story. Comment where you are listening from so we can connect, and be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.